Everybody, welcome to our webinar on data analytics and financial KPIs for the nonprofit industry. Today, your presenters are me, Katie Bird. I'm a director in the audit department, Tony DeSantis, who's part of our data analytics team, and Steve Nebbia, who kind of assists in the data analytics side, but also runs a lot with our outsourced accounting group. Just a couple of housekeeping items. If you do have any questions, you can just go ahead and put those in the chat. We will be monitoring that so we can answer questions as they come, as well as about partway through the presentation, if you need any CPE, there will be a polling question. So that polling question will help you get the CPE for the webinar. So with that, I'll turn it over and talk about kind of what we're going to go through today.
Great, thanks, Katie. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're calling in from. Looking forward to the discussion today. Again, my name is Tony DeSantis, lead our analytics and reporting practice. We do have quite a few nonprofit organizations that we work with, as well as organizations in a lot of different industries. So the goal today is really to talk through why we're even here presenting about reporting and analytics. Certainly buzzwords that folks have heard, but want to get into the why we're talking about it, how it can be beneficial, and then really talk specifically about nonprofits, the challenges you may be facing, and some specific KPIs around that. Finishing up with examples of some of the dashboards that we've created for various different purposes, just to really do a little bit more showing rather than just telling on the topic. So reporting versus analytics, I always say when I give these presentations that I could walk into a room, ask 50 people their definition and get 51 different answers. So like to start with level setting, what we're talking about and why we're even talking about it. So if you look at what's on screen, a lot of times where we're coming in to help, our organizations are struggling with one or many of these areas. Very manual processes. We live in Excel spreadsheets and can't get information in a timely manner. We've got data in a lot of different systems. So we see that because of growth in an organization, or as certain areas need a software or a piece of application, those are brought in, utilized for that purpose, but they're not talking to the other systems. And so trying to have that single view, single lens of your organization becomes very difficult. And so really we're helping organizations work through these different challenges through the use of analytics and reporting, as well as process improvement and automation. When we talk about data analytics, at its heart, it really is the process of looking at historical data to make some decisions about what happened, what might happen, how we can do things differently or better, and really driving our decisions, validating our hypotheses or assumptions, our gut feel with actual tangible insights and information. And our goal as an organization, as we work with clients, is really to unlock that data from those source systems and help each organization get the most out of the information they're already collecting. I also like to differentiate between reporting and analytics and talk about some of the process that goes into it and explain a little bit of the why. It's not always as easy as some of the vendors may make it sound, right? Just plug your data in and away you'll go. 80% or higher really revolves around the data and getting that into a place that you can use it and get information. That may be because you have those disparate systems, and maybe how you identify a donor, for example, in one system isn't the same way you do it in a different system. So maybe your accounting package has donors by name, but your donor management system is looking at them and has an ID number. And I have a disconnect between those when I try and bring them together. So how do I get that data to talk to each other? How do I make sure it's consistent? So if I've got free form data entry spots where I could put in the name of an event, however I feel like typing it in that day. If I'm trying to report on event activity, attendance, donations, that becomes difficult if that name isn't standard. And so a lot of the work to start with any of these processes is looking at the data. The next step in that really is reporting on that data. So as we talk about analytics and moving down that path, I need to be able to report on that data in a consistent manner to start understanding what are the questions I need to ask and apply analytics to. So I'm taking that raw data, I'm transforming it into some sort of aggregate summary of information. How many people attended an event? How many donors do I have? How much money did we raise over the course of some period of time? And it's really a retrospective look at what is happening. Once we've got that insight and information, now we can start asking the why did something happen? How can we do more of what was successful or less of things that aren't working? And focus on transforming that data into that insight and information, applying tools, techniques, and different approaches to that data so that we can pull out that information. The other difference between the two, reporting tends to be a push, right? It assumes you know what you're looking at and that I'm giving you that information. Analytics, you're pulling insight out of that data and asking and answering questions back and forth of the data. I always like this visual as we talk about the approach and the process in analytics. I think all of us can relate if we've got kids or when we were younger, that pile of Legos that's laying on the ground, you've stepped on them in pain. But that's what most organizations' data look like. And whether you're in a for-profit or a not-for-profit business, most organizations' data starts in this spot. It is a mess of information that's difficult to sort and understand. And so the process you need to work through is looking at, okay, how do I just make basic organizational components of that data? Is it our donor information? Is it our accounting information? Is it operational information? So that's where we're starting to just sort it by color, right? What's an easy thing to identify and get organized? Then I'm starting to arrange it into size and shape. So that may be, what does an individual represent? Okay, that's donor information and demographics about them. That's transactional information about how we're interacting with that donor. How do we contact them? What channels work for them in their behavior? And so we're starting to arrange that information. At that point, I can start the reporting and think about presenting the information visually. And I can organize that in a way that makes sense for the individuals that need to consume it. And ultimately, hopefully, that data is explaining what happened in some sort of story. So it is an evolution and it's an iterative process. Oftentimes we hear organizations say we want to wait until our data is at least sorted. And the reality is you never get it to 100%. The reporting and visualization can actually help you get better data, understand where your gaps are, and how to move that process along. But if you wait for it to be 100% perfect, you're never going to get to a point where you actually feel like you can report. We hear a lot about data visualization, and there's actually scientific reasons why this works. I'm not going to get into the details, but if you look on the right-hand side of the slide, visually, most of us see patterns, trends, much more visually than we do in rows and columns of data. Even not knowing what you're looking at, there are certain places your eye's going to get drawn in that upper right image versus that rows and columns data spreadsheet in the bottom right. There are some, I work with a lot of accountants, maybe a couple in the room with me today, that spreadsheets make sense to them naturally, but most of us are going to look at that visual and be able to make make sense of it. Just by way of example, so this next slide that I'm about to bring up, I just want you to take a second and try and read through it. So, yeah, some of you may have gotten all the way through. I'm sure most of you made progress. This highlights why data visualization and dashboarding works is, this very idea. The first and last letters in the right place, the rest is a mess, right? You probably saw it pop up and I'm like, oh my gosh. But as soon as you start to take a second, the brain automatically can piece it together. The same thing happens when we're talking about data and visuals. Similarly, if I asked you to take a look at this view and count the number of fives that exist, I can give you 10 seconds, I can give you 30 seconds. Some people are counting down rows or going across rows, down columns. And if we took a quick poll, we'd get a bunch of different answers. Some of you have 9, some 10, 11, 12. But if I simply add color to that, probably in 10 seconds, you can count that and know that how many fives we've got in there. So some of these tips and tricks make a difference and are why we try and communicate data more visually. So whether that's a chart, whether that's adding color or size to how we're displaying information, there is an art and a science to how we're doing this and why we're doing it. So as we start to talk about the reports and the dashboards and what we're looking for, there are really three main kinds of dashboards that are going to be out there. There's the executive summary. This is more of your billboard, drive-by. We want to communicate some key stats about the organization quickly, clearly, and make it meaningful. Now, I mentioned in the last slide that this is part art, part science. The key is that everybody doesn't look at even the visuals in the same way. So a visual and a dashboard that looks great to myself, Stephen or Katie, may not resonate for you. And so understanding that and getting to who needs to look at it, what message do we need to communicate, how do we do that effectively is important, regardless of what type of dashboard you're looking for. But as we go into meetings and we're summarizing data for clients, this executive summary kind of strategic dashboard of point in time, here's what happened, maybe some basic trends, but what are those key metrics that we need to look at are important. The next one's going to be more of a monitoring dashboard. So data is changing. It's very dynamic. We want it to alert us to something. That may be real time. The reality is what I often say is it's near real time. So some sort of periodic refresh that then tells me, hey, somebody's past due, or they're coming up past due, or we haven't followed up with an individual in X period of time. It's now time to start doing that. We want this dashboard to start to prod us and indicate that it's time to do something. It's time to act. And we often talk about exception reporting, right? How do I look at the good things and the bad things quickly and not have to scroll through a list of records to figure out what needs to be done or actioned? Anytime I'm asked for a spreadsheet of information, my next question is, what are you going to do with it once you get that spreadsheet? And can I make that process easier and deliver you that insight of what you were going to do? Well, I'm going to sort it and look for these types of behaviors. Well, in dashboarding and data visualization, we can make that a repeatable process that doesn't rely on one individual's understanding of that data set and can programmatically create that environment so others can use the same information, get to the same, at least starting point of those items you want to research. And then finally, something that may be more analytical in nature. And this is where the individual using it is going to ask and answer questions of the data. We go back to one of the earlier slides. Why did it happen? Why do I need to be doing this? How do we do more of that? Why do we have that big spike? What was different about that year, that month, that quarter? And being able to drill into the data without having to go back to an IT person or somebody else and saying, okay, now I need this variation of the data, or could you sort it this way and group it? Creating a dashboard that allows you to drill down to the next level. So, we may see a year that's of interest. I want to be able to click on that year and go to the details. What's the monthly breakout? What do we look by weeks? What are the events associated with that? So it becomes very interactive. And the nice thing with the dashboarding tools that are out there right now, we can interact with dashboards like this and have other visuals filter automatically. So that kind of lays the foundation of why we're talking about analytics and reporting, why it works, and some of the high-level dashboards and types of dashboards that you're going to want to look at. We're going to pivot a little bit and now talk about more specifics around what are some of those struggles for nonprofits and why reporting and analytics is of high importance for your organizations.
Yeah, and I think before I even get started with these specific issues, Tony touched on something that I want to reiterate. 80% of the work is getting the data correct. And we see a lot of times with all sorts of organizations, whether it's for-profit businesses that are large, small, medium-sized, or even not-for-profit businesses, having consistent data and having accurate data is a challenge for almost every organization. And so we see that as a big issue. And Tony alluded to it a little bit, kind of going through this process of creating dashboards and refining your reporting needs will highlight those issues that are out there and highlight ways that we can, put some controls in place so that data does get entered correctly, and we do have the data that we need to report accurate information. All right, so some issues that I think not-for-profits specifically struggle with that we've seen here as we've gone through creating data for folks and doing accounting for folks. One thing that is kind of unique to not-for-profits that some for-profit businesses have the same complication, but most don't, would be not-for-profits, generally speaking, have more than one business service line. So we're dealing with a foundation which operates, taking donations and raising money, putting on events. We're dealing sometimes with a store. We're dealing sometimes with, programs that are serving people. We're all sorts of different business models come into play there. And generally speaking, it's more than one per not-for-profit. And so that kind of creates a challenge with reporting where we're looking at two different types of businesses, if you will, or two different types of operations. And so that does create an issue where the organization or people want to make everything fit into one business model. And that's just not realistic a lot of times with the way that not-for-profits are set up. Another not-for-profit specific issue that we run into or that we see a lot is restricted fund and accounting, or restricted fund accounting and reporting. When we talk about data, when we're dealing with restricted funds, there's another piece of data added to every single transaction. And that just becomes another way that we can have dirty or inaccurate data. And so having that be consistently cleaned and reporting on it in an accurate manner can be a challenge for not-for-profits. A couple other ones that are a little bit more accounting related, but can also be areas that create issues for data analytics and reporting. Budgeting sometimes gets done on an Excel spreadsheet and just gets saved to desktop and isn't put into a format that can interact with some of the other metrics. When we talk about data analytics, a lot of times, the key is to have a number to measure a number against. And so whether that's a benchmark last year or a budget, all three of those provide a good baseline to measure yourself against. And so a lot of times the budget is done in a way that it becomes hard to use with the other data that's being produced because it's done in a different way than the other data is being produced. Donor reporting and pledge reporting, I'll just touch on both of those. Those can be a challenge. Tony alluded to, you have two different systems and your donor's name might include the middle initial in one and doesn't include the middle initial in the other. I know he used a number and a name, but sometimes it's as simple as that middle initial. And it's just, we can't track these people, or maybe it's in one system we have the wife and in the other we have the husband, and okay, well, those two people should be treated as the same, and they aren't. And so that kind of stuff gets really complicated with donors. And it's important to keep that clean, but it's very challenging to do that.
The more you can stay away from having to match on text values, the better. So assigning an ID, even arbitrarily, makes a difference, especially if you're in multiple systems, so that you can say, even if I've got that middle initial, I know they're the same and I can draw them together. And then the idea of households, right? So if you want to be able to look at related people, creating another level of ID that ties them together as well.
And then the last thing I have up here is just pledge reporting. We've seen this a lot, and honestly, this is an issue for-profit businesses as well. Tracking AR is a challenge, and knowing who to collect from is a challenge. With a for-profit business, you've rendered a service or delivered a good, and so you have a right to get paid. Whereas for a not-for-profit, you might just have an agreement with somebody that they're going to give you money. And so tracking that down, getting payment, things like that, and making sure that you're appropriately offsetting pledges when payments are made, all of that becomes a pretty big challenge for not-for-profits.
And I think a unique side of that on the nonprofit side is, typically in a for-profit business that, time lag between the providing of a service and the collection of payment is pretty close. But you might have pledges that span over, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And my guess is that most of the time that's a relatively manual process of tracking to make sure, hey, it's December of 2023 and you at this point should have received your third payment from, this donor. That piece is definitely a unique aspect of the nonprofit world.
So that's kind of my not-for-profit specific slide. And now we have some other issues that not-for-profits face that, again, this is pretty, across the board for-profit and for not-for-profits. We've talked about the, donor management and having different sources of data that don't tie to each other. A lot of folks might have that donor management software like Razor's Edge or Bloomerang. They might have a place where they're collecting payments from donors, which, might look like Stripe or something like that. And then, they might have a list of people that were at an event in Excel. And so all three of those being different becomes a challenge to kind of make those all talk to each other. And we've talked about why that's the case, but expense details can be the same way. If you're talking about, okay, I write checks sometimes, maybe I pay cash sometimes, maybe, I use a credit card that belongs to me. Maybe I use a credit card that belongs to the organization, and kind of getting all of that and harnessing all that information to make sure that it's all coded accurately and you can use it to determine how you're doing. That becomes a challenge. And again, this is not a specific not-for-profit issue. It's just a general issue, but it's something that we see not-for-profits struggle with as well. And then payroll and time information, again, becomes an issue. Hey, how are we keeping track of how many hours folks are working and what they're working on? We've talked about the budget being in Excel, and, overall, I think if you look at this list, each one of these problems or each one of these areas may apply to the same organization. And so you start to talk about different data sources. And, even in that first bullet point where we're talking about donor data, we might have 3 different sources of information. Then we have a few different sources for expenses. Now we have the payroll information and then the budget. And it starts to become voluminous in terms of how many pieces of software and how many places you have to go to find information. And so just in general, the various data sources and how many spots you have to look becomes an issue for harnessing the data and getting it to talk to each other.
The other outcome we see of this is that systems start getting used in a manner they weren't intended to. So QuickBooks is a good example. We see that folks put more information into QuickBooks to try and use that as a reporting engine. And now you're stretching what QuickBooks really wants to be doing and can do efficiently. And it's still not exactly the reporting you want. And so trying to solve your reporting issue by making a system that really isn't designed for the reporting purposes of bringing all of this different data together then creates another set of challenges that folks are dealing with.
And, you know, we don't need to spend a lot of time on this because this is basically what we've been talking about. But, you know, duplicate and bad data, huge problem for all organizations. And, you know, I listed a few examples up here: donor data, pledge activity, and restricted revenue. Those are all things we've talked about, but those are all examples of, you know, kind of, I'd call them like hot areas for this to be an issue. You know, you're going to see a lot of duplicate data and pledges. You're going to see a lot of it in donor information, and you're going to see a lot of it in restricted revenue. And maybe you're not going to see duplicate data, or you're not going to see something tagged appropriately when it should have been for a pledge or for a restricted contribution. So those are kind of some of the struggles we see not-for-profits, you know, deal with. And again, it's not an issue that only not-for-profits face. And so we see that across the board with all of our organizations. But by working through this, by being aware of it, we have helped a lot of people clean up that information so that they can produce KPIs and produce dashboards that they can use to measure themselves.
So hopefully it's starting to become clear of why I had that data layer and it was 80%, right? And, you know, some of this is you're not alone, right? You're probably sitting there going, oh, gosh, this all resonates and our data is a mess. Most people are having that same feeling. For-profit organizations have that same issue. The key is that it isn't insurmountable. You're not resigned to it having to be that way. There are, you know, obviously different levels and you know how much you can get into it, but there are ways and solutions to address these problems in effective manners that, you know, those KPIs aren't going to be relevant if they're not accurate and not reliable. And so that's why we're spending this time talking about the data and thinking through your process to get that right, or at least directionally moving to the right spot so that the KPIs then have meaning, that when you're reacting to them and making decisions, you've got some level of confidence in them. So yeah, that leads nicely into just the general topic, right? Key performance indicators. What's the purpose of them? Why are we using them? And some considerations around it. At the basic level, though, we're trying to measure how we're doing. You know, what's working, what's not working. So, you know, what are those measures specific to your organizations, specific to your goals that need to measure and that you can react to and do something about? Right? At the end of the day, you don't want to be capturing a number that, yeah, that's great, but we've got no control over whether it goes up or down. So what are those things as an organization that you have influence on and can make decisions to change behavior when you have that metric? The other piece that's important, and we will get into specifics on some of the KPIs that make sense, but you know, when we start to visualize those metrics, we need to understand what they're telling us, what the visual, what the trend may be, what the number means in and of itself. And so we use this example. You know, the time period coincides to you know, time for our outsourced IT group and the number of tickets that they were serving over a monthly period for almost a year. And somebody looked at this visual and purposely took away some of the detail, but looked at this visual and said, that trend, that pattern looks familiar to me. I've seen that somewhere else. And so we went and grabbed the Douglas County COVID caseload. And so the red line is our tickets. The blue is the COVID caseloads. And so there's a pretty strong relationship between reported cases. And if you think about our business as an outsourced IT provider, one of the service areas, all of a sudden people are working from home who hadn't worked from home. So they start calling in and saying, I can't connect. I don't know how to use Teams when I'm not in the office, or I need to be on my VPN. So things that wouldn't normally happen in the day-to-day behavior of our service desk, where they're getting phone calls from our clients, there was a real world influence on what was happening. And so the context and meaning of the visuals and the KPIs and the environment that it's happening in is really powerful to understanding what's going on. So the KPIs are going to have content. What is it that we're measuring? Number of donors, average donation, number of events. Maybe it's a personnel ratio and personnel expense compared to revenue generated. What are those things we're measuring? Back to my earlier point, why are we measuring it? What does it mean? What can we do? What decisions are we going to make based off of that? And then what actions can we take? So that's the content of that KPI. The context is going to be, what's the time period we're looking at? What we say slice or dice, what grouping or categorization of it? Is it the overall organization, all events? Is it individual events and then further breakdowns within it? Is it donor behavior and looking at it there? To Steve's point, we're going to look at it comparatively, this year versus last year, or month to month, period to period, same time at a different point, compared to budget or compared to goals. Is it monthly, quarterly, annually? All of those things go into the context of what you're looking at and influence how you're going to read and analyze that KPI.
I think the big thing with KPIs in general, and Tony kind of touched on it earlier, I think the most important there is key. So which KPIs actually matter to your organization? There's several listed on the next couple of slides, and honestly, the possibilities here are pretty endless. So, while step one is really getting your data in a place where these are actually relevant and useful, step two, I think, is figuring out what's important to your organization. What is it that you feel like is kind of worth the investment to start measuring, and also just knowing what options are available out there. Probably most of you, when you think of KPIs, you think of them in the realm of financial KPIs. So, these would typically answer the questions, are we on track with our finances? And are we putting our money in the right place? I think sometimes there's a bit of a misunderstanding in the nonprofit world that, you aren't trying to get a profit. So if we land at zero, that's the goal. And perhaps that's not the case. There's a lot of other ways of measuring success. The number one way I think that people look at it is the budget versus actual. And Steve talked about that a little bit. A lot of times that's more on the reactive end. And so you're seeing, quarterly or monthly, where are you sitting budget versus actual, for the year to date. And it's a lot of times it's a manual process. So how can we get that in a format where you can be monitoring that regularly, so that if things do kind of get, off track, how can we pull them back, get them more on track? A few of these other ones listed are things that I see quite a bit. And I think one really to focus on here is the program efficiency ratio. as you guys might know, a lot of your reporting comes on your Form 990, and that goes to your donors. And oftentimes that impacts whether someone's giving you money or not. So a very relevant ratio on your end of, are our dollars going towards our programming, or are we spending money on things that maybe we don't need to be spending money on? And oftentimes I see that that's really only evaluated on an annual basis when that 990 is being prepared. And that 990 is probably being prepared, in the year subsequent to the year that occurred. So you're not really measuring that on a timely basis and getting the right information that you need.
Yeah, and that's a perfect example of that, reaction versus managing by exception, right? So if I'm looking at that, even on a quarterly basis, right? Is it trending up? Is it trending down? Then I can drill in deeper to what's driving that. Where are we spending more dollars? Did something come up that was unexpected, or have we lost some control of spending that we need to address? And so that's where you think back on the monitoring and the analytic dashboards. I want something that's giving me exceptions. Hey, we're starting to get into that yellow zone of that ratio is going higher than what our donors and we would like. Let's dive in and address it before we get to the end of the year, or even farther behind and go, oh man, we really missed the boat on that one last year.
And now we're 5 months
Right.
into next year and we're doing the same thing.
Yeah.
And I don't know if anybody on this call has ever had this happen, where you get to the end of the year, you have a surplus, which is a good thing. And you're like, well, we didn't spend enough on program and it's going to hurt us on the fundraising trail. And I wish I would have known about that in, 3 months before the end of the year. So we could have gone out and done something with that surplus and, boosted that ratio so we wouldn't have a hard time raising funds next year. And so we see that a lot too, where, we're trying to make sure that we're appealing to donors as much as possible. And if you're dealing with data that's 5 months old, you're going to have a hard time getting on top of that.
And that becomes the other part of the analytics and reporting. There are tools now to make that process more efficient. And a lot of the reason it is done yearly is that it takes so long to get it done. So with some investment up front to build a foundation that allows that reporting to be repeatable is key, so that you are seeing it on whatever that frequency makes sense.
Operational KPIs is kind of the other major category I'd probably place these into. Are you effectively reaching the community, and is your time and resources, are they being spent in the right areas? These kind of tie into the financial KPIs as well, but something I see a lot just in looking at a variety of nonprofits that we work with is, you kind of just keep going about your business in terms of the programming that you're providing on an annual basis. But that's largely because there isn't the information being used. Perhaps you think that your number one program is, program X, but if you were to evaluate, the satisfaction of the community surrounding the benefit that they feel they get from program X, maybe it's really low. Or maybe you can see that program Y is the most important program for your organization, but you have very few dollars coming in. So that can help you, appropriately look at fundraising. And maybe that's something to go into the fundraising side, where you can go out to donors and say, hey, program Y is really important to us. Here's how much it benefits the community. And you can see that, it's operating in the negative. And so we really need funding to help continue that forward. So there's a lot of opportunity in operational KPIs. I think it goes a little more into the effectiveness of where you're putting your money, as well as how well you're reaching, different areas of the community, both from a donor standpoint, but also from a beneficiary standpoint.
Yeah, I think there's some other areas as well. If you're a nonprofit that, maybe it's not direct donors, but memberships, right? And I know we've had a number of clients, both whether you're looking at donors or customers, around that segmentation, and really using the data to start to tell you what are those segments. You probably have a gut feel, but I know when we've worked with clients in the past, using the data and let that drive the segmentation starts to create some stories that maybe you just didn't think about. And really leveraging that to go, okay, there is a different group here, not just the big spenders or the big donors. They're the big donors who have these other attributes, and they need to be in a different group than, similar size donations, but they've got a different makeup and what appeals to them and how much they're involved in the organization. And so now you can start to talk about the next slide, which is the marketing component of this.
Yeah, and I think, marketing KPIs sometimes I think fall by the wayside. We're in the age of social media, and marketing is a really important part in social media especially for nonprofits. And to be quite frank, it's probably an area being covered by someone who already has, 10 different hats. So how can we take the information we're getting from these KPIs to help us make decisions on the marketing side? So again, the financial KPIs, the operational KPIs, both of them kind of help, pull into these marketing KPIs that really help you tell, are your marketing campaigns successful? So I just have a couple up here, but Tony kind of touched really well on the donor side of things. Again, sometimes if we're just looking at top line revenue, maybe we're not really factoring in, maybe we had 100 unique donors last year, and this year we only had 60, but we didn't really see that because one donor gave more money this year than they did last year. And I think it starts to show where opportunities lie in, not only pulling in new donors, but maybe taking your existing donors and appealing to them to try and get more funding from them, get them a little more integrated with the cause.
Just some additional kind of operational stats, and we've touched on those, but the idea here is they can be as basic as, what is my average donation amount? And, if something is based on your population, if the goal is we just need to increase average donation amount by $5, that's something that's much more attainable. You can translate that to what that means overall and set up a game plan related to that. So the idea is that these don't have to be sophisticated, complex, I need high-end analytics. What you're going to find is you want to start with those basics and build and evolve to, okay, we've now gotten sophisticated enough, or our data's in a much better spot where a donor segmentation effort is going to be more valuable because I have more data points. They are more consistent. I can start to create that KPI that means more for me. But, from simple to complex, back to Katie's point earlier, figuring out what makes sense for your organization is key. The normal donation behavior is an interesting one. And we've done that from a customer side. We've done that from a donor donor side is, okay, they seem to consistently donate once a quarter. So now I can start saying, they didn't donate last quarter. What happened? I can proactively reach out just as a touch point. Maybe that's all they need, or maybe something's changed in their situation. Usually we get a big donation at the end of the year, right? Tax applications, folks are doing that. Are there behaviors that we can look at and get ahead of them? So starting to look at those patterns of behavior are interesting from that operational side of things. And cost per event and some of those ratios of, are we in balance for how much we're generating in activities versus what we're getting back, so that we can make decisions ultimately at the end of the day of how we change our behavior.
And I think something too that's interesting about this is it can take what seems like a really large goal and turn it into something that maybe feels a little more able to succeed. If you think you know that you need to raise an extra $100,000. Well, perhaps you have done your donor segmentation and you see that you have, 100 people that all give $100,000 to the organization. Well, maybe you go back and ask for an extra, $1,000 to $5,000 from each of those donors. That's a small ask at the individual level that can have a large impact for your organization as a whole. So it kind of helps, you guys start to put together measurable goals based off the information you have.
Yeah, and on that line with those different types of donors, and going to do a new campaign or new capital raise or something along those lines, knowing what characteristics your large donors typically have will help you target new donors that are going to be your larger donors. And so having that segmentation available makes the development officer's job a lot easier, because you can go out and, fish for some bigger fish.
All right, so mentioned the polling question to get your CPE credit. So thanks for bearing with us. And once we get through that, we will do a quick run through of some dashboards that we've created that show some of these KPIs just visually, how those can be displayed. And again, if there's any questions, get those through on the chat, and we'll address what we can in the time we have left. Okay. There we go. Now for the fun part, right? So how does this all come together? And these are examples or dashboards we've used before and that we've created templates for based on data sources we look at, but helps kind of show you what can be done. In this case, we're looking at donor information, right? So who are our top donors? You see here that we've got a blank. So we've got some amount of donors that there's no name associated with us. That's an indication I need to go in, see what's going on. Is that a training issue? Is it a system issue? Where do we go look at and rectify that? Maybe it's we've got anonymous donors and that's acceptable in what we're doing, but a way to be able to look at it and understand. Again, there's a lot of information on this this particular dashboard, but it was through conversations with the end user. What are the people that are using it? They don't want to be able to jump to a bunch of different places. So I can look at average amount by donor. I can look at number of donors just by clicking those buttons and tabs at the top of that chart on the left-hand side. Seeing quickly the gift types, how much is out there from pledges and pledge payments and gift in kind, all those types of information that you have at your fingertip. And this may all be stuff that you're able to get to or you have access to, but it's probably piecemeal or you can't do it often enough. This dashboard is actually something that can refresh daily or hourly if need be, and have that information so that your teams are spending their time looking at it, analyzing what it means, and making decisions about the operations and what you want to do next, not simply putting reporting together for you.
I also like that this one can be used in a mobile setting so that it is updated daily. And you're out at some sort of networking event, you can access some of this information and get some real insights while you're working.
And this one takes a look at it, a little more from the donor level. So a couple of different views, right? On the top left, amount by bucket. So we're looking at the total dollars based on the amount of giving by particular donors. So not surprisingly, in this scenario, right, our $50,000 or more donors make up, a big portion of the overall revenue or donations that are brought in. But if you look at the next line down, number of donors by bucket, that's a very small sliver. And most of them are that $100 or less. So we can look at that and start to make decisions. Do we want to grow the $50,000 bucket in number? Probably yes. but can we move those $100 or less up to the $100 to $1,000? And how do we do that? And that could make a significant change. And maybe our goal is to make that $1,000 to $5,000 a bigger portion, representatively of the overall. We can also look at trends over time as well.
The one that he was just talking about, where we've got a small number of donors donating a large amount, and that makes up 34% of the total donations. This is an example of reporting that could eventually turn into more of an analytical situation where we're going to say, okay, what's the cost of that dollar raised? How hard is it for us to go get another $50,000 donor versus going to get $50,000 donors? And so kind of weighing those costs against each other, thinking through how do we lower the cost, those sorts of questions, asking the data, what are those $50,000 donors? Who are they? What do they like? How do they interact with us? And trying to lower that acquisition cost, to steal a term that's not necessarily appropriate in this situation, but I think it's applicable in terms of we are spending money to go raise this money, and we need to be thoughtful about how hard it is to go get those big donors, because you're servicing fewer relationships and you're raising more dollars, but it's going to be harder to find them and harder to win them over. So, taking it a step further, that's something we could do.
Yeah. And then the bottom ones on there, to show some examples of stats that can be created that start with that donor segmentation, right? So this actually has two purposes. One is to show data quality issues and what reporting can mask, but also what are some of those stats that you could look at. So, we can see total donation amount for the selected time period, average donation, those numbers of donations, but then let's look at it. Okay, what's over the last 3 years and what's that average, and the number of donations, keeping track of when they last donated. We've got an analysis that says, hey, somebody that's donated in the last 3 years but hasn't donated in the last 365 days is probably somebody we want to follow up with and understand why. The number of months they donated, so are they some sort of quarterly donation or monthly donation, or is it once a year type thing? So we start to understand those stats. You look down to the blank line, the donor name. This is a data quality issue we pointed out in the other ones. But even if that had a name in there, we'd want to look at and drill down and go, okay, 415 donations. Well, that's clearly multiple items in there. And so how do we want to be able to drill into that more and understand and go, okay, that's probably not an accurate representation of an individual donor's behavior, and make sure we're recognizing and understanding it. So that's where people understanding the organization, the behavior, letting the data lead you to that, but also drilling in and asking more questions. Giving an idea of different looks and feels, right? This is a little bit more of that executive dashboard, some key financial metrics. And Steve, maybe you want to talk a little bit about this and components of it.
Yeah, and so this is one that we use with our outsourced accounting offering, where we just kind of talk through, where are we at with the cash? Where are we at in terms of net revenue for the year? We don't, this is kind of the starting point to ask the follow-up questions. How are we doing on cash? How are we doing on our operations? And, what seems to stand out from a question standpoint? And then we kind of dig into that, and, maybe we flip to let's go to the next one. And so maybe we look at this and we say, hey, our revenue isn't quite what it was last year. And so we come over to this next page and we say, gee, if I look at May, we really, we're way up on revenue through the first 4 months, and then something crazy happened in May. And it says, I think 0 there. If I could read it, maybe it's because we haven't recorded our May revenue yet. But, in this situation, this is the type of question that you'd want to ask is, okay, well, what's off here? It's revenue. Okay, let's go look at revenue. You get here and you see that, oh, hold on, I need to I need to calm down. We're not gonna lose the organization money yet. We got to figure out what we actually took in May. And so those kind of questions, that's kind of a bad example because the data is not good, but it's also a good example because the data is not good. It shows you kind of how we use this and why it's important to have that updated data.
And to also think about, that leads in our report building exercises, we then go and say, okay, wait, there's some delay. We want to make sure we're managing that, right? And so we're comparing to actual time periods. And so if we're looking at year to date, we want to make sure we're looking at year to date last year when we're doing those comparisons. This is a common one we see all the time, right? Is if you're looking at it kind of mid-month analysis versus last year's full month, you're always going to be behind. So you don't know where do we need to go or how far off are we? So then we're saying, okay, we really want to say, don't show me any further than where I am right now. So I'm comparing that apples to apples consideration. And a lot of these just become variations of the same, different looks and feels and different pieces of information. So in this one, we're looking at more of the program activity and revenue.
Yeah, we don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but if you're looking to compare a bunch of different, activities, locations, business lines, there's ways to do it. So.
Yeah. We'll just flip through a couple other, we're getting here up on time and want to be respectful of that for everyone. Yeah, and here we can start to look at vendors, where are we spending money? We can hover over different areas and see information pop out. So to Katie's point, if you're looking at those ratios and go, why are costs up? This may be a starting point to go, okay, Keystone Kitchens, we've spent more this year than we have in years past. Why is that? So different ways to look at that data and information. This one's a little bit more specific as we talked about funds, right? Looking at the current balance of funds and understanding what's happening, transactions. And so you can see these dashboards can also be blends of visual and tabular information. Sometimes it just makes sense. I need the transactions themselves, but being able to sort them, filter them, look at them in different ways is going to be key. And the other piece, kind of a budget analysis, right? We talked about comparatives. Here you're looking at actuals versus budget. How much of the budget have we gotten or are we at? Knowing the trends over time so that we look at it and understand. We don't have one on AR specifically in here, but we talked about knowing what pledges are outstanding and having a way to monitor and look at those things all become powerful things to look at. With that, any questions pop up as we were take a quick look before we end this? So there's a question about what dashboarding tools do you recommend that would be simple, effective, and economical? So Power BI is what most of these are built in and the tool we use for delivery. The nice thing about that is you can start for free. You can download the Power BI desktop and start to use that immediately. So that is a useful option. Tableau is out there. I do know that they do have pricing for nonprofits, but I believe to get started, you're going to be on a licensing subscription for them right away. Even with Microsoft, the Power BI, you can start that for free. If you want to start sharing and publishing, then you need to go to a license model, but they do have nonprofit pricing as well. So those are two options. The key is don't get sucked into the just plug your data in and it'll work. It takes some time to use those, to think about the model and the data. 99% of the time when we hear that the tool isn't good, it's generally end user error, quite frankly, that not knowing either tips and tricks